Well, good day to everyone. This is the YouTube channel Faith Seeking Understanding. I'm Alan Bevere. I'm a pastor, professor, and I am a connoisseur of coffee. And I say that because our guest today is also a connoisseur of coffee. And in fact, he is the only person I know who has an espresso maker in his car. And what does that plug into the cigarette lighter, Lee? Is that what it does?
It does, yeah. They recommend that you pull over before you use it.
Yes, they do. So I'm sure you do that because you are a very sane person. But yeah, you're the first person, the only person I've ever known who takes his espresso that seriously. So certainly, my motto, one thing we have in common is our motto in the morning is not the best part of waking up is Folgers in the cup.
No.
Yeah, we have to, we take our coffee very seriously. So my guest today is Lee Wetherbee, and we're going to talk conspiracy theories, or at least talk about personalities and conspiracy theories. Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself.
At present, I am a professor and department chair in the clinical counseling or clinical mental health counseling program at Ashland Seminary. And in the past, I have functioned as a social worker, as an employee assistance program counselor. I worked in community mental health, and as a clinical director of a fairly large mental health practice. And so I've got a fair amount of diversity in my portfolio, or certainly in my past. At present, I have pretty limited clinical work. The focus of the clinical work I do right now is personality assessment.
Okay. Yeah. And you do a lot of testing and assessment as well.
I do.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And you also, I need to say, is you and your wife are members at First United Methodist here in Ashland, where I pastor. That's
right.
So, yeah. And so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. At least on my end, anyway.
Yeah, well, for me as well. I keep looking for, the thing that struck me when you first started doing virtual church is there's a section that Ryan, who's the one who put the video together, pans down the center aisle. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised at the strong emotional reaction I had to this building. I didn't know that was in there. And that really surprised me.
I'll tell you, it's tough preaching to an empty room. And the one thing that I've realized in giving the sermons in that way is how much I actually draw from the energy in the congregation. In some Sundays you're more energetic than others, but the reality is I do draw off of that, and I think that it is at least maybe no one else notices, but I notice it when I'm preaching. So anyway, so maybe at some point we'll be back in soon and be together again, which will be great. So let's talk about conspiracy theories for a moment, or conspiracy theorists. I think we want to make a couple qualifications. First, there are sometimes conspiracy theories that turn out to be true. Governments can have secrets. Corporations, big entities can have secrets. We know that. And so sometimes conspiracy, it's sometimes being suspicious that there's more to a story than we know is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
But having said that, I have known some personalities over the years who tend to just grab onto almost every conspiracy theory out there.
Sure.
And so my first question to you is, what kind of personality seems to be drawn to the conspiracy, that there's something bigger going on?
Yeah. And let me add my own qualification. We talked about this before we started taping, but we're talking about people that don't have a clinical diagnosis. They're not struggling with mental illness. They don't, this is not a psychotic process.
Right, exactly.
It's an interesting constellation because I do personality assessment. I think of it in terms of personality traits. And the literature seems to indicate a really interesting combination of personality traits. Individuals who are prone to believing conspiracy theories have what seems like a mix of traits that don't feel like they should go together. They tend to be pretty open in terms of what Carl Rogers called openness to experience. They're really open to alternate explanations for things. So they're going to be pretty open to, and I don't mean this to sound silly, but things like Bigfoot or
Right.
UFOs and things like that, where those of us that don't have that trait are going to say, well, no, that's unreasonable. I'm not going to believe that. So you've got some pretty strong openness, and in a seeming contrast, they tend to be pretty suspicious. They tend to be pretty skeptical, not very trusting, and in some cases, kind of disagreeable.
Okay.
And so it's really an interesting combination of things. I think part of how that sets them up to believe in conspiracy theories is they're going to be skeptical of authorities whose approach doesn't fit their personality. And they're going to be open to theories that the rest of us would reject.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's interesting you mentioned some of that. So, for example, when I think of alternative explanations, I mean, you certainly can be open to an alternative way of explaining something,
Mm-hmm.
but not necessarily embrace conspiracy theories.
Right.
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 So, so I guess, let's talk about the skeptical part of that. They tend to be skeptical and suspicious of things. So are these folks who also tend just not to be trusting in general of people?
Yeah, tend not to be trusting in general. Tend to be folks who are socially alienated from other people, and so and they tend to be fairly concrete or unsophisticated thinkers, and that's not a comment on their intelligence.
Right. Right.
But they don't. They have a really low tolerance for ambiguity.
Okay. So for them, everything just needs to be crystal clear.
Right, right, and fairly uncomplicated, fairly simple.
Yeah. Which explains to me whenever I'm dealing with someone who is bought into a conspiracy that their explanations usually are very, very in-depth, very long, and they've got it all figured out. So the lack of ambiguity, also part of that would be or the lack of ability to accept ambiguity, and they're not complex thinkers, so nuance certainly is not something that they're going to understand.
Doesn't tend to be. Where there's complexity is kind of what I'd call the backfilling, where they come up with complex ways to explain how things that are not connected are connected. They've come to typically they come to conclusions about relationships between events or variables that don't exist. They're prone to doing what I warn my students against ever doing is concluding causation from correlation. Because two things happen at the same time or close to each other doesn't mean they're related.
So can you explain that a little bit more, that causation does not mean correlation?
Sure. Because there's a strong relationship between things, or because they appear to be related, doesn't mean they are. Silly examples that I use when I've taught a stats class. There's a very strong correlation, very strong relationship statistically between ice cream sales and boating accidents.
Okay.
Yeah, and you picked up what the third variable is. Yeah, it's summertime.
Yeah.
But if you didn't know that, also a really strong statistical relationship in any particularly urban area, the number of churches and the number of bars. And you can spin all kinds of theories about the struggle between good and evil, but they're related to population.
Yeah. So there's a connectedness, but not necessarily a cause.
Right. That's right.
And so if I'm understanding you, the problem with some, or the attraction that conspiracy theorists have to this is that they see correlations as causes when there's no evidence to suggest A causes B. A and B are correlated, but they're not. They don't lead to, one doesn't lead to one to another.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And it, the other piece, and I think this is kind of universally human. I mean, we all want to feel special.
Yeah.
So, I think part of the attraction is I'm going to feel pretty special if I feel like I've got the inside track that other people don't have.
Yeah. And how does that relate? I think you said that some of these folks tend to be, I don't remember what the word is. I want to get the word right. Alienated or not in. They're on the margins. They're on the margins of social groups or whatever. And so does that then lead them to want to have a theory that will get them in the circle in a sense?
Well, I think part of what happens is, if I share conspiracy theory with other people, then I've got a sense of membership, a sense of belonging, a sense of fitting in,
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of specialness.
Right.
It's no surprise that the first of the 7 deadly sins is pride.
Mm.
And so I think conspiracy theory really panders to our pride, our universal human need for significance.
Right.
And so, I think that's, and being on the inside track can pass for intelligence.
Right. Right. Where does, in some of these theories, where does confirmation bias play in? Because, for example, I know that there seem to be some conspiracies that are not connected to one's political views. My experience with people who are anti-vaxxers, and I would say that's a conspiracy theory personally. I've run into anti-vaxxers who are liberals, conservatives. That doesn't seem to be an issue there. But I think of late, so for example, with the COVID-19, I think the vast majority of conspiracy theorists that I've encountered, their politics tends to be more conservative. But I also remember back after 9/11, having actually colleagues of mine whose politics were more to the left, really entertaining the notion that George Bush knew about 9/11 beforehand, and so where does confirmation bias sort of play into some of this?
Well, I think it plays right into that idea of being special. I don't want to admit that I might be wrong, okay. And so I'm going to look for theories that, like you said, confirm what I already believe.
Right.
And I think part of what happens again, and that kind of uncomplicated thinking happens throughout the political spectrum.
Yes.
If I tend to be an alienated person, if I tend to be on the margins, I'm going to look for something that bolsters what I already believe, because I'm probably not secure enough to look for things that challenge what I already think. And I'm not, I'm kind of in the echo chamber. I'm not reading things that are from sources that don't confirm what I already believe. And the other piece that happens is, confirmation bias really is just a hermeneutic filter.
Right. It's how we interpret things.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that with the sources. We live in an age of social media and the internet. We are not starving for information anymore. We've got too much of it, and that of course creates its own kind of issues of sorting through things. But let's talk about what is necessary, or what kind of practices should I engage in, for example, myself, so that I am not prone to go after a conspiracy theory, because I could be, I don't want to say I'm immune from that in certain cases. What do I have to surround myself with in order to not go down that path?
Well, I think what we need to do is consider the source. The example that is a humorous example from my past. When our daughter was about 4, I was passing on some, I'm sure, pearls of fatherly wisdom. Mm-hmm. And she, as 4-year-olds can do, she looked at me really seriously, and then she said, "Who told you that?" I guess as though I couldn't come up with it on my own. And I use that as an example. I've used it with students and with clients to say, this is what we want to pay attention to. When I'm looking at something, who's telling me this? What's the source of this? And even if we're not prone to being skeptical, to be a little skeptical, and just pay attention to what is this source's agenda, and how credible is this source. And so I think we need to take the time to find multiple sources leading to the same conclusion before we start to take something seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, that was funny you said that. I always say that children go into two stages too. My dad knows everything to dad, you don't know anything. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And at the tender age of 4, she was headed toward the second.
Yeah. At some point, the mystique starts to wear off. Yeah, as they grow up. Yeah. So the other thing along with that is I can't tell you how many times I've heard persons who are sort of into these theories also just you talk about considering the source. What they do is they write off every kind of reputable source. It's all fake news or it's all suspected. I don't know who to trust in the media anymore. Right. But of course, they do have their sources they trust, and usually they're pretty fringe sources. So is there a justification? Can we justify believing these things because we simply don't want to engage other sources because we just don't trust them? We have decided we've decided to be ignorant. I'm going to be ignorant of what this source says because I just can't trust them.
Yeah, and I think I have to be careful here, but I think in the current political climate, a masterful job has been done of undermining the credibility of what in the past we accepted as authoritative sources.
Yeah, I agree with that. And not that sometimes some of the media hasn't helped that.
Oh, absolutely.
They certainly have helped hurt their cause, I should say. But that doesn't mean that there are not sources out there that can be trusted. Yeah. So let's talk about the skeptical of authority. You said that these folks tend to be skeptical of authority. What authorities do they tend to be skeptical of?
Well, skeptical of authorities that don't support their belief in conspiracy theory. I talked about the importance to consider the source. I think in their minds they do consider the source. They say, well, that's the mainstream media or that's the liberal press, and they've got a bias. And to an extent, that's accurate. There is an agenda, and so I think that skepticism. And let me add to that, in North American culture. I think there's some social status and some social reward for being cynical and being skeptical and being suspicious. There's almost a sense in our culture that if you believe things just at face value, then you're not very bright, or God forbid you're naive. So I think that plays into that skepticism.
Yeah. I'm always suspicious of the people on social media who use the word sheeple, right? As if, this is the conventional wisdom. So you're all just, you're like the lemmings heading over the cliff. Actually, that was actually an image somebody I know on social media used a while ago. Who's not who thinks, who believes, and, of course people are allowed to raise questions and have their beliefs, but he believes that the lockdowns that we've had are a mistake. Okay. But basically compared those of us who think that there was probably a necessary move to make, we're heading like lemmings over the cliff. Yeah. So there's kind of a reward. So that also, but the other thing that does is that it gives you a reward in that you stand out from the crowd, right?
Right. That's right.
And you're a free thinker.
I'm a free thinker. I'm not one of the sheeple. I just don't accept things at face value. And so it passes for critical thinking. And it interests me to see, not just in social media, but in the news, how inflammatory the idea of masks are.
Oh, that has just absolutely befuddled me. And so I guess the question, Lee, is why latch onto that?
Yeah. Well, I think I think for people that don't think masks are necessary, for some reason it's inflammatory.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understand that. I think if I'm out in a mask, it challenges your belief that that's unnecessary. And I think,
Ah,
and I think part of what we're seeing too is the change in our culture, uh, where there's no such thing as expertise anymore. Everybody's opinion has the same weight. So, somebody at the post office may feel comfortable accosting me and telling me that I'm making a mistake, or that I'm, one of the sheeple because I've decided to wear a mask to protect them from the possibility that I'm asymptomatic.
yeah, I think it was Isaac Asimov who said we live in a culture where now your ignorance is what important or as valid as my knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Whatever, he said something along those lines. Of course, that's part of that problem. Isn't that endemic to living in a society where democracy is so critical? Everybody gets to vote. I've always said that the great thing about democracy is everybody gets a voice and vote. The bad thing about democracy is everybody gets a voice and vote, right?
Yeah.
And so there is something about that kind of expertise. I mean, I think of some persons who like to use the word elites, and I think that's the word. Maybe that's a cover word for just the rejection of expertise and those who have a certain kind of knowledge in a specific area that I simply do not, and that. For those persons who are conspiracy theorists, isn't that kind of expertise, isn't education just suspect?
Yeah, I think anything that confronts the conspiracy theory, and from my perspective, I mean, I'm not going to put on my psychologist hat if somebody's upset with me. I'm just going to avoid them. But
Right.
if you're, to use the mask example, if you're upset, if something about my wearing a mask upsets you because you think it's unnecessary, how secure are you in your belief that it's unnecessary if you feel the need to harangue? So,
Yeah, right. What am I saying about myself, not about you? What am I saying about myself if I feel the need to say something to you publicly about your mask? I don't even know who you are.
Right.
That says more about me than it does you.
Yeah, that's
talks about insecurity. So also I'm detecting here with the conspiracy theorist personality. I don't know if there's a such thing, but I'm not a psychologist, so it's not my area of expertise. So I can be a little sloppy in my.
I am a psychologist, and it's not my area of expertise.
Well,
either.
yeah, but you're helping me out. You're doing a good job. I appreciate your insights here. And just to show you, I just lost my question I was going to ask. That's what I get for ad-libbing.
Yeah.
But I was going to say something about. I know what I was going to say. I was going to say something about the insecurity of that. That there certainly seems to be an insecurity of behind this, almost a fear.
Yeah, well, I think there is, and I'm trying to be careful. I mean, I want to be respectful of people who are conspiracy theorists, because I think the temptation is to say, well, these people aren't very bright. There's something emotionally defective about them. And what I'm trying to say is there are some personality traits, life experiences that make it more likely that a conspiracy theory is going to be attractive to you. Mm-hmm. I think it just comes back to that low tolerance for ambiguity, and I guess what I'll call low complexity thinking.
Low complexity thinking, yeah. No, I think we should be clear. I don't think either one of us is saying that conspiracy theorists are not smart. We're trying to assess what kind of personality, or think about what kind of personality tends to be attracted to that kind of thinking. I knew a person, who's passed away now, but I knew a person who never met a conspiracy theory he didn't like. Mm-hmm. But he actually, I knew his background. He grew up in an environment there was not much trust. He was not nurtured in any trusting relationships growing up with his parents. and in other contexts. And so he was by nature just suspicious of everything, you know.
Yeah. And I think that's a significant linchpin in the personality makeup of people who are enthusiastic about conspiracy theories, is just that lack of trust.
Yeah. Okay. This sort of reminds me a little bit of the second and third century Christian Gnostics who had the secret knowledge. We know the mysteries, and if you want to know them, you need to be ushered into our community.
Well, and a couple of things that tells us it's not brand new. This didn't just happen in the 20th or 21st century. And, the Gnostics got quite a bit of traction. There was, the apostles had to work, or the believers had to work pretty hard to keep people from being drawn into what the Gnostics had to say.
Yeah, no, it did. It was a real challenge for the church. I read something the other day that I found intriguing, where this writer talks about even Jesus warned his disciples about not going after conspiracy theories. When he says, you'll hear people saying the Messiah's here or over there, don't believe them. And then even I was thinking that when Jesus is coming down off the mountain of Caesarea Philippi, he asks, who do people say that I am? He's basically asking, what are the rumors out there? Mm-hmm. What's the conspiracies, And so this is something Jesus seemed to warn about. So let's talk a little bit, and maybe this is less psychology, but since as you are a believer, and I'm sure you've given thoughts to some of these things, what stake do Christians have in trying to avoid falling into the conspiracies?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes back to a sense of who's in charge here.
Yeah.
Do I, the wheels fell off about Genesis 3, and
yeah,
where Adam and Eve wanted to be like God.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be careful about, buying into theories that give us control, as opposed to being able to faithfully accept that God's on the job, independent of how it looks to me.
Right.
And I think that's the key to so much of Scripture. Job, immediately comes to mind for most people, but there are parts of Ecclesiastes that say, you know what? I always think of Ecclesiastes 9:11, the emergency verse, that says things don't always work out like you think they were going to. I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, right.
Things don't always work out like you think they should. However, God is still sovereign, and God is still on the throne. So I think we have to be careful putting ourselves in charge.
Yeah. And not all things have to be known as well.
Well, exactly. I as I was thinking this through and knowing we were going to meet, it occurred to me that North American culture has really lost a sense of mystery, we're really uncomfortable with mystery. And you and I have each, I'm sure, talked to non-believers who want definitive answers about
right.
very specific things, and are not satisfied when I say, I don't know. And I try to add, I don't have to know. I don't, that's not necessary for me. I think early in my faith, I wanted to be well-versed in apologetics, so I had an answer to everything. And probably as I've gotten older, I'm much more comfortable with, God has taken such good care of me and has been so kind and gracious to me for decades that I don't need to know details.
Yeah. There is something, and I've become the same way as I've gotten older. There's something, actually, to be honest, there's something that I find comforting about ambiguity. That I don't have to know all the answers, and particularly as a pastor, I don't have to know all the answers. This was many years ago in another church, a parishioner was upset at me one day because she asked me a question, and I don't even remember what the question was anymore. And I said, well, I don't know. And she asked me, what in the world was the church paying me for if I didn't know the answer? So there is something about ambiguity. Maybe there's something about ambiguity, the willingness to embrace ambiguity at times. Is there something about an emotional maturity about that? Don't you think?
Sure. Yeah, I think that is the case. But you and I again are both aware that many people's frustration with our denomination is that it doesn't have as many rules as some folks wish it did, or
Right.
The United Methodist Church, part of what I love and hate about it is it doesn't tend to take a lot of really hard and fast stances on things.
Right. Yes, that's right. So at times we're okay that they don't, and at other times we wish they did. So yeah, right. And that's sort of
around my pet issue. They should have a specific stance.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And if they don't address it, then I want to move on. One final question, and I appreciate again you doing this. Back to the issue of Christians and a stake in not running after conspiracy theories. As you say, it's an acknowledgement that we're not God, we can't know everything, and that's okay. But is it not also a concern? The problem is that even though, let me say it this way, even though it seems that people who fall into these conspiracy theories want to know the truth, actually the reality is that they undermine what is true. And isn't this bad for the witness of the church? Because if I go after every crazy conspiracy theory out there, why are you gonna believe me when I say to you, Jesus loves you and wants you to follow him?
It makes perfect sense, but that's not how these people are going to see it.
Okay.
I think, there's a reason Jesus talked so often about turning how we see things in terms of status and control upside down.
Yeah.
And so I think there are factions. I think it's a universal human challenge. I think there are factions of the church that are seeking significance and seeking importance. And so they, they take some pride in feeling persecuted, if that makes any sense.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense.
And I think for some folks, this will sound harsh, but probably because it is. Some folks that I've seen who have talked about, well, they were just persecuting me because I'm a believer. I have to think, no, you were kind of being a jerk, and they were having a natural reaction to you. I don't think they were persecuted.
It had nothing to do with your religion.
Yeah. Having said that, I don't in any means mean to say there isn't persecution.
Right.
Not so much in North America, but in the rest of the world, absolutely.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But for Christians in the U.S. in general to feel persecuted, I think is having lost the focus.
Yeah, I think part of that too goes to the fact that the church, certainly in 2020, doesn't have the cultural influence it once did, and I think sometimes what we are mourning, we think we're promoting the cause of the gospel, but what we're really mourning is the loss of that influence. And so we want to try and get that back. As I always like to quote George Hunter from Asbury Seminary, if 1957 ever returns, the United Methodist Church is ready.
Well, and you've written about the ways that the church has kind of co-opted itself by aligning itself with political power,
right,
as opposed to being that revolutionary witness that we're called to be. And I think part of the problem is, in general, mainline denominations are not distinct from the culture.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think there are some mainline clergy who think that somehow we present a radical alternative, but I think we're just bourgeois status quo, and that's why we are experiencing what we're experiencing. I mean, we're really no different than a thin veneer of Jesus here and there. And right now, some of our mainline listeners are pulling their hair out to hear me say that. But I think that's really what it is. And I wonder, by the way, is if we really took more seriously the witness of the gospel with the church as the alternative, to the world and to the systems, that maybe we would be less enamored with conspiracy theories. Right.
Well, and what occurs to me, I mean, we're kind of coming full circle here, but
Yeah.
when you look at Jesus' ministry, there was a conspiracy,
Mm-hmm.
and he was well aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we look at his response to that very real and life-threatening conspiracy, I think that's our model.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Jesus knew there was a conspiracy. He knew how this was going to end, and yet he, in service to the mission that he came for, he continued to move forward. And just, I think of that pivotal dialogue with Pilate, where Pilate's saying, "Don't you understand that I hold your life in my hands?" And Jesus says, "You don't have any power that I didn't give you."
Yeah.
Which was not the right answer.
Which was not the right answer, definitely, at least not from Pilate's perspective.
Yeah.
Well, Lee, thank you. Lee Wetherbee, professor of clinical counseling.
Yes.
Correct, at Ashland Theological Seminary, and I appreciate your time, and thanks so much for your insight.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Everybody take care.